In the first module, when we are looking at, we are going to look at all the external and internal factors. Primarily, the first module will be the external factors, where we are also going to look at this, what stage of the organization, what kind of regulations for each sector, what are the statutory regulations, okay, then what are the competitive market forces which impact compensation, all right, and unions as well. So, in fact, after having talked about in detail on these things, then what we will be looking at is the next. How do we establish? We'll be looking at all the three equities. How do we establish internal equity? Now, when we talk about internal equity, we are talking about what? The worth of the job. Because when an employee is comparing how is he being paid vis-a-vis the other jobs, so we have to first of all understand, say for example, just for example, that there is a sales manager, okay, and there is also a vice president sales. Why should the salaries of a sales manager and a vice president salary be different? Because by the virtue of what the vice president sales does is so different from what the sales manager does. So the worth of the job of a vice president is much higher as in compared to the worth of a sales manager, because it needs higher education, maybe qualifications, experiences, competences, effort, etc. So when we are talking about job evaluation, and which we talk in detail with various methodologies and technical tools, we'll talk about how do we establish the worth of the job in the organizations to establish internal equity. So when we say job evaluation, it is what is the worth of the job in relation with the other job. We help you to deal with this job evaluation by talking about various technologies like job ranking, job classification. Then we also look at point rating system and factor comparison. So we will in detail talk about these things through case studies. How do you establish the worth of the job, and in detail about point rating system? That means you assign points. For example, if a sales manager has been assigned points through job evaluation as 400 points, and a vice president has been assigned through job evaluation 800 points. So obviously the difference between the points of 400 and 800 is 400. So the job is much larger. The vice president job is much larger. So we will explain to you how do we go about by identifying compensable factors, factors which actually you pay for, you pay the money for. Okay. Now, having done that, then we will also then talk about um, after having done the internal equity, then we will be talking about how do you then, somebody said, yeah, market benchmarking, salaries with the market. How do you actually benchmark the salaries with the market? What is that? How do we go about? How do we do compensation survey? How do we collect data? Then how do we then analyze the data? Uh, then how do we make interpretations of the data? So we take you into a detailing of the entire market benchmarking, what we call it as, right from the start of identifying what kind of companies you need to look at, then what kind of data, what are those components or elements you look at in terms of collecting data, then how do you go about collecting data, primary data, secondary data. Then we give you a good absolute understanding and also case studies in terms of having collected the data. Then how will you go about analyzing this data? Like for example, if you were to say after doing a benchmarking, hey, I am at P78, D7 and Q3. If a consultant tells you, what does it mean for you? How do you go about understanding this? Okay, so we will explain to you, and also you will get a hands-on experience of how do you go about looking at percentiles, quartiles, deciles. How do you look at an array of data? So we'll take you through a lot of statistical analysis. Having said that, the interesting part, then how do you next establish your internal individual equity? So when we talk about individual equity, that is what we are talking about. When two people are working in the same job, as I said, if two people are working as HR associates in the same job, how do you differentiate, how do you motivate people, for people who work more or to stretch more? So we then look at to establish the internal individual equity. We look at the design concentration considerations of short term incentive pays. Then we also look at long-term incentive base. Now, in fact, we will be looking at the entire concept of total reward strategy. So what is this total reward strategy, which is the most current trend? So when we are actually looking at this session, you'll also look at what are the current trends in everything. So various sectors, what are their current trends? How do they go about with the design considerations of their incentive base? Okay, so primarily will help you to design short-term incentives, long-term incentives with reference to your own sector or with reference to your own organization. Now, then we get to what is the most interesting thing and how you go about is, where is that? uh, Not the communication, sorry. What, don't go by this slide. The most critical takeaway for you will be also, for most of you, which will be like, a black box. How do you design a pay structure? For most of you, I'm sure, it's like a black box. How do you design a pay structure? How do you go about it? What are the elements? So we will be helping you in understanding how do you, step 1, step 2, step 3, how do you design a pay structure? What is a pay line? What are pay ranges? What are these midpoint differentials? We look at mid, mean, median, mode, etc. So some of the real takeaways are like, enabling you to design a pay structure which suits you, which suits your budget, etc. Then we also talk about the reward communication. How do you then communicate the entire reward very effectively? Yeah, one second. How do you communicate reward very, very effectively? What are those things, step 1, step 2, step 3, you need to do in order to get the, a kind of consensus on whatever you are communicating as a part of the reward strategy? Because it is not that you design your policies, your processes, but if your stakeholders are not convinced with what you're doing, because it involves about the salary, the reward, the benefits. So it will help you to understand how do we effectively uh, communicate the reward. Okay. Now, so this was just to give you a brief on the entire overview of what are we doing right from the beginning of external environment to the internal environment, and then talking about all the equities of internal equity, external equity, and individual equity, and reward communication.